Hi there friends, welcome to episode 55 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter and I'm a tech editor. Today we're going to play a little bit with increase methods. Play's maybe not the right word to use in that case, but I want to talk about substitutions if you don't like a particular method or if you're struggling with a method, and maybe some best practices to consider if you're going to make substitutions. At the end of the last episode, I sort of suggested there were do's and don'ts, and that sounded really black and white. And I think when it comes to substituting methods of increases, it's more of a gray area. It comes down to your personal comfort. So let's take a look at some methods of increases, some substitutions, and then some things to look out for if you're going to make substitutions from what the pattern calls for. So there are several kinds of increases that you can use in your knitting. They range from very simple to slightly more complicated depending on how they are used in your knitting. But in my mind, I break it down into basically two categories. There is a no stitch increase or a stitch used increase. What I mean is for a no stitch increase, I'm talking about a method of increasing that does not require you to use a stitch to make a new stitch. So a very simple example of this is a yarn over. In between two stitches, you simply wrap your yarn around the needle and create a new loop. Until you come back to it on the next row or round, it's not really a stitch. It's just a loop around your needle, but it's made between two existing stitches. So you're not using an existing stitch to create a new stitch. Also in that category would be lifted increases, like a make one left or a make one right, or an actual right leaning or left leaning lift. So I'm not going to talk about the actual mechanics of those stitches, but more to just address the fact that they can be used in your knitting to add stitches without using an existing stitch. On the other side of that coin is a stitches used increase method. I'm sure there are plenty out there, but the only one that comes to mind off the top of my head is the knit one front and back. To create a new stitch, you will knit into an existing stitch through the front, and then twist your needle and knit through the same stitch through the back loop. You've created a new stitch by using a stitch. So they both work, a stitch made between stitches or a stitch made using a stitch, but how they apply to your work when it comes to integrating them in designs is where we start to fall into that gray area. If you're working a slightly more complex stitch pattern, let's say the Night Shift Shawl by Andrea Mowry. I bring that up because it's a very popular pattern. It's not an overly complex stitch pattern once you get the hang of it, but she uses a no stitch method of increase in that particular pattern. Because you're working that increase adjacent to an I-cord, some people really struggle to not only know which bar to lift to make the stitch, but they also struggle with tension, which is totally normal. So some people have written in to ask about substitutions that they can use instead of a make one right. And there's really, without impacting the stitch pattern, there's really only the methods that I've talked about just a moment ago. Either the lifted increase, or pardon me, the make one method of increase where you lift the horizontal bar between strands so you're not using any stitches to create a new stitch, or the yarn over method. The make one method will give you a more seamless look, and the yarn over will give you a bit of a hole or an eyelet in your work. Both will work, but Andrea specifies the lifted or the make one method of increase simply because it's the cleanest in terms of the look of the shawl design. So the other conceivable method of increase that you can use is the stitches used method, which I already talked about. It's the knit one in the front and back. If you are working a fairly simple fabric, say stockinette stitch, and you're just knitting on the right side and purling on the wrong side, and you're not worried about the number of stitches that you have to use at the edge of your work, a knit one front and back is a great substitution option, there we go, for a no stitch increase method. You're just going to knit one front and back and continue in your row, whether that's a purl row or a knit row. However, if you have a specific stitch pattern that you need to maintain, using that stitch to create a new stitch can create a bit of a challenge if you're not comfortable adapting a pattern. You could say, well, it's just one stitch, I'll fudge it, and I am all for that. Try it, see what works. But if you've got a small stitch pattern where you're going to notice that adjustment of one stitch, or something really technical like maybe cable work or something where you need that stitch that you would use for the KFB to be part of your project, it's maybe not the best option. So I say that that is a gray area because it's really up to the knitter to decide how comfortable they are making adjustment to the pattern they're working from if they're moving from a no stitch method of increase to a stitch used method of increase. So since I think that finding solutions to cobbling problems is something worth exploring, I started taking a look at no stitch options that you can replace or substitute if you don't want to have holes in your work. I'm talking pretty specifically about a make one increase being replaced with a yarn over. The yarn over will create a hole in your work when you come to process it on the next row or the next round. And aesthetically, that may not be something that you want to consider. So the best way that I have found to tackle this is to work the yarn over on your row where you need to make the increase, just as you would if you were working the make one increase. But when you come back to it on the next row or the next round, you're going to knit or purl the yarn over through the back loop. What that does is twists the two legs of the stitch that was originally just the wrap of the yarn over so that you close up that hole. But if you are someone who has a really hard time with the make one method of increase, this has become my go-to. For example, I'm currently working on a very simple shawl with a garter border on it. I didn't want to have the yarn over holes at the edges or at the center seam, so I simply worked them as a yarn over on the right side and then knit them through the back on the wrong side. And it makes a really clean fabric that doesn't force me to have to adjust my stitches when I'm working the pattern because I'm still not using a stitch. So here I am at the center spine of my shawl, and I've come across my two yarn overs on each side of the center spine. Instead of knitting through the front of the loop, which would create a hole, I'm going to knit through the back of the loop to twist the stitch closed. If I wanted to have the fabric in stockinette stitch instead of garter, I would purl through the back loop. To do that, you're going to move your yarn to the front between the needles, and then you're going to go into the back of the loop and purl the stitch. One more time, move your working yarn to the front, twist your stitches a little bit, and insert your needle through the back of the loop and purl it. But since I'm doing my shawl in garter stitch one more time, I'm going to knit through the back loop. And if we take a quick look at the work, we can see that I used yarn overs on each side of the center spine. But when I got into the border, I wanted it all in garter stitch, so I have twisted the stitches closed over the center spine. Here's an example of a little 2-color striped swatch I knit up. There's I-cord edges, and I change colors every 2 rows on a right side row. I have made 3 increases over this swatch, and they are always made on a blue row. So here is a make 1 style of increase. When we worked this first blue row, we lifted the bar between stitches from the row below to lift this stitch. Because this is an I-cord edge, it's actually lifting from this bottom row. The top row, we dropped our yarn to slip our stitches at this I-cord edge, so it's a little bit taller than it would be had there been no I-cord edge. I have a tutorial linked in the description below this video to an instructional video on how to work make 1 rights and make 1 lefts adjacent to an I-cord. At our next blue stripe, I've worked the yarn over increase method. I began knitting my 3 stitches of the I-cord, worked a yarn over, and then continued knitting across the row. On the return row, I worked this stitch here, which was on top of the yarn over, by purling it through the back loop. So it closes up the whole of the yarn over and remains in the stockinette stitch pattern. And finally, I worked a lifted increase on this 3rd row. When I worked in my blue stitches, I knit the 3 stitches of the I-cord, lifted the leg of the stitch in the row below, and knit into it. So once again, much like the make 1 style of increase, our row below increase is 2 rows tall. Here's the other one here. So although they look very similar, they are both a V, they are not 2 rows tall as we see it in this yarn over twisted section. So that's my argument for using a twisted yarn over in place of a make 1 if you struggle with the make 1 right or make 1 left increase method. The other thing I wanted to address was the knit 1 front, back, front. So this is a method where we use 1 stitch to create 3 stitches. So you knit into the front, the back, and the front of the same stitch. It's very compact and you don't end up with holes in your work, but the movement of the needle sometimes feels awkward for people, and depending on your stitch tension, it can also be really challenging. The substitution I've started using is a knit 1, yarn over knit 1, or a kiok, a K yarn over K, depending on how you read it in your knitting. The simple adjustment to make to this method is when you get to the yarn over or the center stitch of that knit 1, yarn over knit 1, you're simply going to knit or purl it through the back loop to close up that gap. Once again, anytime you are making a modification like this, the tension may be slightly different. For example, the yarn over that you twist closed may be slightly more open than the adjacent knit or purl stitches on each side of it, but it prevents having any tension issues that you may experience with the knit 1 front, back, front. So there we go. That's kind of the overview of different options for substituting in increase methods. I would love to hear if you've either tried these methods or if you are going to try them, and just share what your experiences are with it. I think everybody has their own issues with one particular style of increase. I know that I don't particularly like the purl bump that results from the knit 1 front and back, and I know there is a method, I want to say it's Meg Swanson, who uses a knit 1 in the front slip back, which does get rid of that purl stitch, but I've never found my tension is particularly consistent. I really like using the yarn overs and twisting them closed where I can. As we are now in October, and I would like to say it's fall, I'm still in a t-shirt today because it's a pretty warm day, but the rest of the week is cooling down. We are in Rhinebeck season, and this year I'm actually going to be attending Rhinebeck, so I'm pretty excited about that. Because of that, I'm going to postpone our next video to be in 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks, just to make sure that A, I can maybe share a little bit about the trip with you, but also B, just to make sure I've got the time I need to create a quality video for you. Because our next video is going to be a little more technical. We're going to be looking at how to fix the tension of a stitch if you have pulled your work, so you've got a long pull in your knitting, or if you're changing colors using the intarsia method. It's a similar technique for both of them, so I thought I would put them together in one video. So you won't see me in 2 weeks, but rather in 3 weeks. As always, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It's always an honor. If I get to see you at Rhinebeck, or maybe if you see me at Rhinebeck, pop over and say hello. I will be there with a couple of my best girlfriends looking for all the fiber to spin this winter. And until 3 weeks from now, have a great rest of your week. And as always, happy knitting.